It's a strange and even partly amusing discovery in Scripture when we find people who shouldn't be afraid of God always being afraid, while others who apparently should possess every reason to fear God hold no fear of Him at all. If you're finding these videos helpful, would you consider sharing them with others, and maybe together we could help more people? I'm convinced that's what we should do, right? Help others the same way that we've been helped. Anyway, back to the lesson. I should have shaved, huh? My mom would kill me. True story, and it involves two boys at the turn of the last century back in Britain, two boys who were inseparable. From birth, they played in the same street together, went to the same school, same classes, and when World War I broke out, they enlisted together and were kept together serving in the same regiment. They were eventually deployed together and actively involved in the same trench warfare together. And the only meaningful separation that came was when one of them was chosen to advance across no man's land and the other one was chosen to stay. Well, needless to say, like hundreds of thousands of others, the friend who went over the top didn't come back, and the friend who was still in the trench begged his sergeant to allow him to go find his friend, and was obviously denied the request. His sergeant assured him that it would be a colossal waste of time because his friend would already be dead, and to go into no man's land, especially alone, would be nothing short of a suicide mission. Well, the boy wouldn't let it go and kept pestering the sergeant until eventually he did let him go, again reminding him it would be a waste of time. Sometime later, the boy came back with his friend over his shoulder, and he laid his friend down in the trench. And the sergeant looked over and said, I told you he'd be dead. I told you it'd be a complete waste of time. And the boy said, but it wasn't. When I got to him, he was still alive. And I got to be with him as he died. And I got to hear him tell me, I knew you'd come. I knew you'd come. Greater love has no man than this, said Jesus. Then he laid down his life for his friend. God never met a man he didn't want to be friends with. And if there's a single sentence more helpful in evangelism, then I've yet to hear it. God never met a man he didn't want to be friends with. Chapter breaks can often tempt us toward divorcing what we are currently reading from what we've just read, and sometimes, more often than not, it's crucial to the flow of the context to try and discipline ourselves not to do that. This chapter opens with the words sometime after or sometime later. However, even although it does that, or precisely because the text does take time to mention that it was sometime later, I don't think it's a coincidence that Abraham's vision and dream comes straight on the heels of Abraham giving up the offer of riches from Sodom. In other words, perhaps the author has intentionally skipped everything that lay between those two stories in order to connect those thoughts. And if that is the case, and I'm suggesting it is, then these stories need to be cemented a lot closer together than a chapter break would propose. Didn't Jesus say, those of you who do not give up everything you have cannot be my disciple? So this idea of sacrificing because of God or sacrificing for God is a golden thread that runs through the entire rope of Scripture. Isn't the rich young ruler advised that the path better chosen will appear more luminously if he'll just give away all his riches? And we'll observe, of course, that one would be unable to pick up a cross and follow anyone unless our hands were already empty. If this was a class on Jesus, we'd have a look at what those weighty, seemingly impossible instructions mean. But for now, it's enough to recognize that God is often a God who not only acts within the scope of the human family, but a God who arguably more often reacts within the realms of human history. Even within the first 14 chapters we've already read here in Genesis, it's littered with those examples. The garden with Adam and Eve, God reacts. Cain kills Abel, God reacts. The flood, undeniably, God reacting. And Babel, again, is God reacting. With the introduction of Abraham, with God actively seeking him out, I believe we're dealing with God's greatest preemptive act since the creation itself, as God moves decidedly toward relationship with the human family. Perhaps in a way that he hasn't before, or maybe he has and everybody else said no. Whatever it is, this is happening now. And in chapter 15, we're fortunate enough to be given a little glimpse into how Abraham understands this relationship to be with God. We're also shown in the conversation that Abraham has with God that there's nothing flippant in regards to Abraham's understanding of the relationship, or more particularly the promises that he'd been given. He genuinely believed them. When things didn't turn out as planned, or at least as far as Abraham had imagined them panning out, he wasn't found trying to explain the promises away. He wasn't found, comparing translations in order to get a different take on things. And he wasn't found attending a local college where the professors were all busying themselves to assure him that the promises weren't meant to be taken literally. These promises were seriously given and were intended to be taken seriously by Abraham, and they were taken seriously by Abraham. So much so, Abraham is now found, for want of a better term, calling God to account. And to all intents and purposes, God appears to be spectacularly fine with it all. A little presumptuous, one might think. Maybe. But only until we notice that 2 Chronicles, Isaiah, and James all refer to Abraham as God's friend. Well, if that's true, if God and Abraham are genuinely, specifically, truly friends, then this is exactly how we'd expect a conversation to go. Isn't this how friends talk to each other? And then some? It isn't arrogance here. It isn't presumptuous. It isn't any early form of entitlement. There's no swagger here. There's no belief of self-importance. It's one friend saying to another friend, you mentioned these promises before, and and I'm not seeing it. And I believe it and all, but no one's getting any younger here. It's accountability, and friendship and accountability share the same bed. It's part and parcel of friendship. We expect our friends to keep their word, or provide an explanation as to why they haven't, or seemingly haven't. And let's face it, it's been some time since the initial promises were given. So taking human nature into account, it would be amiss of us, amiss, and perhaps falsely pious, to expect anything less from Abraham. I can't imagine any of us having anything less to say to God, unless we were putting on a pretense of patience. Abraham's had to go away down into Egypt, had to come all the way up out of Egypt, had a little trouble in Egypt. Now that he's back, he settles a family dispute. He's got a brief war with the budding empires around him, and has considered and refused Sodom's offer of worldly wealth. All these things have taken place, and plenty of other things, I'm sure. So I don't think Abraham's out of line here at all. And I don't read it as though God thinks Abraham is out of line. And the way the author writes, it doesn't appear that Moses thinks Abraham is out of line. So I don't think it's a coincidence to find God here in the manner in which we find him, regurgitating or restating or elaborating upon the previously given promises. And I don't think it's a stretch by any definition of the word to suggest that God is, at least in part, also not only preemptively acting, but reacting to Abraham's great measure of faith in rejecting the riches of this world. So when God comes to Abraham at first, it's the greatest move we covered that in chapter 12. But it's not only acting, it's reacting. And I think we got both going on here. And because it jumps straight from one story to the next, I think that supplies all the justification required to connect these particular dots. What we saw last week in refusing Sodom's gold was Abraham acting in order to leave room for God's benevolent heart to reveal itself, leaving room for God to be glorified, for God to move. He's not found trying to force God's hand. And a God who knows when a sparrow falls to the ground, and a God who can number the hairs on our head, and a God who can see us when we're under a fig tree, a God like that doesn't miss things. And we can tell it isn't arrogance or entitlement on Abraham's part because of God's reaction to him. Like a friend, he speaks in response to Abraham. Like a friend, he smooths away Abraham's fears. Like a friend, he reassures him that he meant every word. Like a friend, he corrects and redirects Abraham's perceptions. Like a friend. And may I add, beyond friendship, the words "he took him outside" have more of a fatherly overtone. So it's good to note that God's friendship doesn't stop at friendship. God takes Abraham outside to count the stars, if he can. And upon that visual illustration arrive the most famous of words. Abraham believed God, and it was counted as righteousness. Unarguably, the greatest redemptive punch that can be thrown by a son of Adam is faith, believing God. And by that act alone, we become more like Jesus than we could possibly imagine. Trust. The reversal of the fallen couple's unfaith. And so it was considered by God as righteousness, alignment, friendship. When Abraham is approached with, "Did God really say?" Abraham responded with, "You bet your bottom dollar that's what he said. I was there when he said it. He said nothing different. That's precisely what he said." And Abraham's got no problem taking the promises of God back to God. He's the anti-couple. And place the emphasis wherever you like. Abraham believed God, and it was counted as righteousness as good. But Abraham believed God is better. And it wasn't for the lack of voices. I'm sure the enemy of enemies found plenty of opportune times in the life of Abraham. Prior to this, Egypt and Sodom are all whispering in his ears. Lot's whispering in his ears. The herdsmen are whispering in his ears. The surrounding neighbors are at war with each other. And later on, Sarah, as you know, is going to get on his case to such an extent that it would be haphazard of us to assume that that was the first and only. But through the fog, it's God's voice Abraham listens to. Through the fog, it's God's voice Abraham believes. And through the fog, it's God's voice that Abraham trusts. We've already seen, and we'll see it again as we read about Abraham, that it won't be a faith that is as strong as the second Adam, but strong enough to reverberate for millennia. The world has no end of voices, all screaming for our attention, you'll have noticed. We'll do well to listen to the voice of the shepherd and trust him. God's opening words, "Don't be afraid," are so repetitive in Scripture, it's where we'll spend the last few minutes. But before we leave Genesis, Hagar and Isaac are going to be told the same thing, "Don't be afraid." Moses will be told the same thing, as will his replacement, Joshua. Jeremiah is emboldened by the exact same words. Ezekiel, Daniel, and through the prophets, God repeatedly spoke the same words to Israel. Well, spoke the same words to Israel when they had no reason to be afraid. Unfortunately, and often it appears, they did have reason to be afraid, but they weren't. It's a strange and even partly amusing discovery in Scripture when we find people who shouldn't be afraid of God always being afraid, while others who apparently should possess every reason to fear God hold no fear of him at all. So, I think it works like this. If you do fear God, there's really no reason to, but if you don't fear him, you have every reason to. Easy, huh? So in answer to the question, well, what does that mean? Should we fear him or not? Absolutely. But if you do, you have no reason to. Just an observation, it appears that God gets some pleasure in watching dogs chase their tails. And maybe not only dogs. In any event, if we're going to spend our life chasing tails, why not have that exercising or revolving itself around God also? If we're going to fail and mess up and get it wrong, let's fail and mess up and get it wrong in his direction. I quite believe it would take up most of the evening to read all the verses that Scripture devotes toward alleviating our fears. But what else would you expect to find in a letter from a father to his children? I've found it to be a considerable amount of my fatherhood alleviating the fears of my children. And then the other half giving them something to fear. So I know how God feels. But countless are the examples of God's people being told not to be afraid in the presence of angels, in the presence of their enemies, in the presence of almost everything that the world can throw at us. And taking it for granted that there really are things that we would be expected to be fearful of. An escaped lion, for example, unless your name's Daniel. I'm speaking about those things we've been specifically told not to fear. Not only because it doesn't change anything, but because more than not, it likely just makes the situation worse. Courage, for example, is never out of place. Fear often is. Choose courage. I've only ever met a few Christians who have been honest enough to confess their fear of death. Though they confess it so sincerely, it gives me room to believe that this is thought about more than just the few that I've heard. And they're afraid of death because, as they put it, they might not make it. They're afraid that they might not make it. And I confess that there aren't many things in life that I've heard that make me sadder than to hear them. Because no. Just no. And my initial response is typically, what kind of father do you think he is? And after everything that he's done, after everything that he's told us, after multiplied millennia of his keeping his word, what, he's suddenly going to change his mind now with you? You're the exception? No! Now, we can think this way if we want to, and revel if it delights us in irrational fear. But we have no justifiable cause for such lunacy. You know, there was a day when our people all gathered inside our homes, eating a Passover lamb, excited because God was coming to deliver us out of Egypt. And no doubt, 2 doors down, there was more of our family terrified because the angel of death was coming and they're trembling. So one thought salvation, the other one thought death. Guess who he saved? All of them. Because their feelings on the matter didn't play a part. The blood of the Lamb played the part. Well, you can probably guess the comeback when I talk to some people. They'll say, Oh, I'm not doubting God, I'm doubting me. But you are doubting God when you're doubting you. It's upon you his promise is resting. And what is it, sin? That's the issue. That's what got you afraid. He annihilated the thing. Didn't he tell you that he's forgiven you? Can't you believe him? And find the peace therein that he intended for that to bring you? that you're a sinner? Dear me, that only qualifies you. He said it was for sinners he came. Specifically. I mean, you're not loving sin, right? I'll ask. You're not here telling me that you're afraid because every afternoon you're rejoicing in rebellion. I take it by the tears streaming down your face. You hate sin. And I'll remind them that he loved you when you loved sin. What now that you hate it? He's going to love you less. He loved you when you looked nothing like him at all. What now that you're beginning to resemble him in a few places, that he's going to love you less? So what's a preacher to do? Well, preachers on such occasions should do precisely what we should do. We speak about shepherds and their care for the sheep. And we speak about chickens and how they'll sacrificially give themselves to protect the brood. We'll speak about husbands and the adoration of their wives. We'll speak about fathers and their unquestionable love for their children. And we'll speak about friends. And we'll remind them that this is the language that God has chosen in order to get it through our heads. His care for us, his desire for us. We speak about the lengths that God has gone to in order to secure us for himself. We'll speak about a cross and its ability to annihilate sin. We'll speak about a tomb that remains empty until this day. Or maybe it's not empty, but it's not him that's in it. And we speak about lives like mine and yours. Lives that have chosen to hide ourselves inside the line, inside the life of the faithful one. And we remind them that he who changeth not is not about to change. That our Father does not abandon his children. So I guarantee you, brethren, as you close your eyes on this side of eternity to open them again, upon scenes of bliss, forever new, rising in succession to your view, when that day comes, your first words, your very first words are going to be, I knew you'd come. I knew you'd come. Our God keeps his word. He who promised is faithful, and he has promised you. After all, what are friends for? Thoughts, comments, questions?